All right, Pope Leo XIII had a meeting with the Eastern Catholics today, and he said some really encouraging things that have to do with the liturgy in the church. We're going to go over that briefly, but this leads me to something that I'm pretty certain about, and that is that the traditional Latin Mass will be brought back in a real way as far as it being more widely available under this new Pope. And I think I know how that's going to happen. I'm reticent to make predictions, but I feel strongly about this. And I will address certain things that I find troubling and to be cautious about. So, those commentators out there who think I've gone soft, don't worry. I'm still a traditionalist. But I do like to talk about the good things if we can. And I think it's good for us to support whatever's good because why not? All right, stay tuned.
Hi, my name is Peter Nelson. I am president of Nelson Insurance Advisors. We specialize in using non-woke Catholic fraternal insurance companies in order to protect our clients and members, whether it be in regards to life insurance or retirement planning. We have over 23 years of experience in the insurance industry, and we want to do business with people that believe the way that we believe. So please reach out to us at 423-793-2613, or you can find us on our website at nelsonplan.com. God bless and Godspeed.
All right, yesterday I had a fruitful exchange on X, Twitter. I don't know if I'll ever be able to call it just X, but I had a fruitful exchange on social media, which is rare because social media can be kind of a dumpster fire. I usually just put things there and leave them, and I don't usually interact too much. But in any event, I had a fruitful exchange that I want to show you. So there is this gentleman, this traditional Catholic author / journalist he's done amazing work. His name is Chris Jackson, and I respect him a lot. He's written a lot for the Remnant and places like that in the past. In fact, he wrote one of the best defenses of the SSPX back in, I think, 2015, and it was a reply to the now defunct, disgraced, and happily destroyed Church Militant. And he wrote, and I understand his caution here, and I understand. And he wrote, do people not remember John Paul II spoke and chanted a lot of Latin? He also excommunicated Archbishop Lefebvre, allowed girl altar boys, prayed with pagans, and kissed the Quran. Those are all true, and bravo to him for bringing it up. And I replied and I said, yes. And in his case, meaning John Paul II, he did it as a pope who followed the trend away from Latin, etc. So his was less than what came before. In this case, it is a turn back towards what was lost. Leo may not turn out well, but if we think we are going to go from Francis to Pius X in an instant, we're kidding ourselves. So let's see if these are mere preferences on his behalf, on behalf of Pope Leo, or steps towards the reclamation of what was abandoned. And Chris replied, agreed. As I said, fruitful exchange, very happy about it. Support Chris's work wherever you can because he does great stuff. Look up his articles. There's lots of good ones. So the crux of this is we have experienced this massive revolution over the last 50, 60, 70 years. Of course, I don't have to go over this over and over again. And under Pope Francis, things got really acute. They kind of slowed down under Benedict in a sense, but picked back up again under Francis. And it's true. The things that we're excited about with Pope Leo are basic things that we in a better time shouldn't find exciting, in the sense of what about it is so special that a pope is praying something in Latin? Isn't that what popes are supposed to do? Of course, it's like the sun is supposed to rise in the east and, water is wet. I mean, these things aren't news. However, these things were taken away from us. They were taken away from us. And so having any of them back is kind of exciting, and that's a natural reaction. But we do have to remain cautious. But I do think, I'll use a little bit of an analogy here, when you see somebody who has like an addiction or a drug problem and then they eventually hit rock bottom after getting into the mud and then kind of coming out a bit and going back and eventually just fall flat on their face and they need to go to rehab or something and they've just hit rock bottom. Well, on the way back, there are small victories and you encourage them in small victories. And they're not where they need to be. They're not where they came from before everything was the way it was. And they're not going to be there for a long time, if ever, in their mortal sense. Obviously, the church is not the same as one person's lifespan, but this is an analogy. So you applaud the small victories, and when you see someone starting to just kind of get back up a little bit from rock bottom and sort of go towards that place of health where they lost, and there are signs that they might be doing that, you think to yourself, okay, let's support them in this. It's not going to be perfect, but let's try to see if we can support them. That's how I'm looking at this right now. And there was another thing that Pope Leo did today, and I'm going to get to my prediction about the traditional Latin Mass coming back and how it's going to happen. But there was another thing that Pope Leo did today, which I want to share with you, that he said, because it's indicative of this trend that I think we're going to see. Okay, so this is a recent statement from Pope Leo. He spoke to the Eastern churches today, the representatives of the Eastern churches. And, okay, I don't know who this Father Josh Miller is, so I don't know who he is. But this is just where I saw the post. And this is from his statements, from Pope Leo's statements. Number one, notice something in this first line. Over a century ago, Leo XIII pointed out that preserving the Eastern rites is more important than is generally realized. Now, that's a great statement from Leo XIII, but you know what's astonishing? You know what's amazing? He's citing a pope from before Vatican II. I don't remember the last time we've seen that. I mean, I'm sure Francis the Odd Time did it. But here's a man named Pope Leo XIV who goes to his namesake, Leo XIII, and immediately comes out with a banger from a pope who ought to be canonized, in my opinion, as one of the great combatants against liberalism. Pope Leo XIV chose his name, and he said about, Rerum Novarum and whatnot, and one of the other documents, the social encyclical of Leo XIII. But here he is, demonstrating he understands the corpus of Leo XIII. He must. That's what I think. I mean, there's no reason to doubt that. My friends, this is a good sign. Again, we're not back to, the perfect place, but this is a good sign, and I'm happy about it. And we should be happy about it. And there are things to be cautious about, but this is a good sign. We have not seen our popes so liberally citing 19th century anti-liberal, anti-modernist, anti-Freemason popes like this in a long time, and I'm very happy about this. He continues, he says, talking about Leo's words, he says, he went so far as to decree that any Latin Rite missionary, whether a member of the secular or regular clergy, who by advice or support draws any Eastern Rite Catholic to the Latin Rite, ought to be dismissed and removed from his office. We willingly reiterate this appeal to preserve and promote the Christian East, especially in the diaspora, meaning those around the world, in addition to establishing Eastern circumscriptions wherever possible and opportune. There is a need to promote greater awareness among Latin Christians. In this regard, I ask the Dicastery for the Eastern Churches to help me to define principles, norms, and guidances whereby Latin bishops can concretely support Eastern Catholics in the diaspora in their efforts to preserve their living traditions and thus, by their distinctive witness, to enrich the communities in which they live. Now, I said I would mention things that I think we should be cautious about. The term living tradition is a term that is used by modernists. Like all modernist terms, or terms used by modernists, the actual words themselves are not intrinsically evil, of course. You can use the term living tradition in a sense. In this sense, it seems like perhaps he's using it in a non-modernist sense. The idea that these Eastern Catholics have these traditions that are alive makes sense. However, there is something to be cautious about with this kind of verbiage. In modernism, you find this in Pope Pius X's encyclical, about which is what my recent book, What Happened to Catholicism, is based on. Why is that there? So you can find that underneath, by the way. But living tradition can also be a dog whistle to, basically tradition keeps evolving because it's alive. And how modernists view life is that there is this continual change. So red flag, but maybe not, depends. But we got to be fair. And continues, he says, the church needs you. The contribution that the Christian East can offer us today is immense. We have, and this is where it gets interesting, we have great need to recover the sense of mystery that remains alive in your liturgies that engage the human person in his or her entirety, that sing of the beauty of salvation and evoke a sense of wonder at how God's majesty embraces our human frailty. If you've ever read the works of Dietrich von Hildebrand, this is very reminiscent of the sort of personalist phenomenological view of the sacredness of liturgy and how a person experiences that. I'm heavily critical of phenomenology and personalism in my book, What Happened to Catholicism, for reasons that I think are strong. Nonetheless, I admit in the book that the thing about that mentality and that way of looking at things, it does allow someone to get to a very sound conclusion. And so a little background. I'm sorry for the quick interruption. If you're still watching this show, I'm amazed. I don't know who would watch me for more than 10 minutes, but if you are, you probably wouldn't mind accompanying me on a trip to the Holy Land, and I would like to have you with me. So if you're interested in a once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage experience, click the link down below for the Holy Land pilgrimage this fall with a traditional Catholic chaplain and myself. Once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I'd love to see you there. All right, back to the show. Dietrich von Hildebrand was a great scholar, and he was one of the original founders of the Roman Forum and things like that. He really resisted the changes after Vatican II. Old school traditionalist. He wrote The Trojan Horse and The City of God and that sort of thing. These really important books. He's heralded as a hero by traditionalists. But he did have a modern philosophical outlook, which he used to his benefit for Catholic tradition, but was also used sort of against Catholic tradition with John Paul II's understanding of personalism and how he viewed the liturgy. That's all kind of inside baseball, and that's in my book, What Happened to Catholicism, which you can find linked underneath. Nonetheless, again, we're talking about being in a church going from rock bottom, trying to get back up. My sense is, people keep saying, that this man, Pope Leo the 14th, is a Francis Pope. I don't think so at all. He seems to me more like a JP2 Ratzinger guy, which is good and bad, depending. But the way that he's speaking about the liturgy, it's very reminiscent of that sort of sacred, instinctual personalism, which again I describe in my book, which is, again, good and bad, can be used for good or bad. And I contrast it to Thomism, or the more perennial thought, where you can be a bad Thomist or a bad scholastic, but the method itself can't lead to radically different conclusions in the same way the modern philosophy can, which is why I think it's more sound. But anyway, so in any event, the thing about personalism and this phenomenological mentality, and they're different, but they're similar. It's kind of like Socrates and Plato, or Plato and Aristotle. They're different, but they're from the same source, and that's important. But the thing about it is that it's kind of like the expression "beauty is in the eye of the beholder," which isn't true, not fully true, but how one perceives things with this very JP2 Ratzinger personalist phenomenological outlook on liturgy depends a lot on personal taste. This is why Pope Benedict XVI found his way towards tradition, because he had personal, traditional, refined, artistic aesthetics. You can find this in how he talks about music. He was someone who personally very much enjoyed the canon of what we call classical music. He was very excellent on that, and sacred music. And when you're someone who enjoys that personally, and it's like a pleasure of yours, you're obviously going to find a liturgy where that makes sense, because it seems out of place in other spots, So I think this is a good sign. Let's go back to what is said. And it's this talk of the liturgies that engage the human person in his or her entirety. That's very personalist, but anyway. That sing of the beauty of salvation and evoke a sense of wonder at how God's majesty embraces our human frailty. That's a good sign. That's a good sign. Talking about how we're weak, how we need a savior, how we need wonder. That's not the Novus Ordo. It is likewise important to rediscover, especially in the Christian West. So he's talking about what we can learn from the East, and there's a reason to be cautious there that I'll talk about in a sec. But rediscover in the Christian West a sense of the primacy of God. That's a good thing. That means theocentric worship. Okay? That means God-centered worship. And the Novus Ordo is not God-centered. It's man-centered. Okay? The importance of mystagogy and the values of so typical of Eastern spirituality. Constant intercession, penance, fasting, and weeping for one's own sins and for those of all humanity. It is vital then that you preserve your traditions without attenuating them for the sake perhaps of practicality or convenience, lest they be corrupted by the mentality of consumerism and utilitarianism. I really like the last word, utilitarianism, because the major problem with modern liturgical practices is utilitarianism, meaning just do things that are basically more practical and useful. And that's where we get this hyper-rationalist, non-sacred setting where all our liturgies are annoying like that today. Okay. Now, one thing to be cautious of is that since the Second Vatican Council, the modernists have used, like I write in my book, I have a line something like, they'll justify a aberration in Rome with a nod to Athens. So they'll often look to the East and they'll use something from the East improperly to justify a novel change in the West. So they'll say things like, well, hey, they do this in the East, we should do this here. And an example of that, for example, is synodality. There is a tradition of synods in the East that is different than the West. But the synodality that we have today, which is very modernist in the sense of, it's like this, the reason why synodality is modernist in the West is because the ethos behind it is that like God is just speaking through all the people and they have to bring that in order for it to become doctrine. That's modernism 101. Like that's basic, the modernist understanding of tradition. Okay. On the other hand, the idea of just getting together and having meetings for practical reasons to deal with stuff as bishops is as old as the church. There's nothing wrong with that. And the East has a stronger tradition on that for other reasons. So you have to be careful when they nod to the East, because it doesn't always mean it's for good reasons for the West. And it doesn't always mean it's for good reasons for the East either, because it mischaracterizes their traditions, which is not good for the East. It seems like in this circumstance, Leo XIV is looking to the East for good reason and talking about what's positive. And he's correct that the sense of the sacred, the mysterious, so on and so forth, has to be recaptured in the West. And where are you going to find that? Well, you're not going to find that in your average parish. You're going to find that in the traditional Latin Mass. And in the purely aesthetic sense, if you do find that in the Novus Ordo, you're going to find that in a quote-unquote unicorn Novus Ordo. And if there is a spread of more unicorn Novus Ordos, then there's going to be a spread of a lot more traditional Latin Mass. Why? Because the unicorn Novus Ordo is very much a gateway drug. And no one likes to stay there for long, So anyway, interesting stuff. Reasons to be cautious, reasons to be hopeful. I like that he's citing popes from before the council. I like that he clearly demonstrates an understanding of the corpus of Leo XIII. I'm not thrilled about the personalist mentality because I think it's been used for a lot of destruction in the church. Nonetheless, if he's going to do it in more of a Hildebrand kind of way, that's been used to help tradition a lot. So be it, use what you can. So I'll get to the point here as why I'm certain or how I think that he's going to bring back the traditional Latin Mass. Well, in his remarks, he has talked about, basically talked about how he wants to continue the path of synodality and collegiality. Okay? Major red flags. Synodality, as I said, as a way it's understood in the West today, is a huge problem. It's modernism. Collegiality, the way that it's been understood since the council, huge problem. And they're both kind of two wings of the same bird. Synodality is, like I explained, and collegiality is basically a parliament of decisions on what doctrines ought to be based on the various bishops' conferences and so forth. And then you basically have separate churches. And so the German problem with the German Episcopal Conference, that's collegiality to its logical conclusion. So it's a huge problem. But here's the thing about these terms. Their meaning is very ethereal in some cases, and people use them in lots of different ways. My personal thought is Leo XIV is a peacemaker. He doesn't want the wars. He doesn't want the drama. And he has demonstrated that he personally is traditional liturgical aesthetics, and there are rumors that I can't find corroborated, but they haven't been dismissed, and they're very prevalent, that he's been saying the traditional Mass personally for a long time. I think what's going to happen is he's going to bring back the Latin Mass in this way. He's going to talk about the synodal path. He's going to talk about the consultation with the bishops, which is very collegial. And he's going to release a document that speaks in this very personalist kind of Hildebrandian way, where he talks about the need to recapture wonder and the living tradition of the whole church and blah, 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 blah. And I think he's probably going to find a way to cite his predecessors, because you can quote mine, all the predecessors, if you want. You can find quotes. And I think he's going to link it to his, I think he's going to link it to his love of Leo the 13th. And there's a lot in there in Leo, which you can find. And I think he's going to find a way to link it to Sacrosanctum Concilium from Second Vatican Council. So basically, it would be something like, in consultation with the synodal process and conversation collegially with my brother bishops, hearing all your voices throughout the world and respecting the popular piety of blah, 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 blah. We have found that in order to recapture that thing and to follow in the footsteps of the Second Vatican Council, which talks about we are going to, restore access for these ways and whatever, and, basically have your Latin Mass again the way that you did before, but call it something different. I think that's what's going to happen. And there's my prediction. So, read between the lines with Leo the 13th. I'm not saying it's 3D chess or whatever. I'm not saying any of that. I'm reading him and I'm going, he's a man who's been formed in the modern seminary fashion, who personally, through his reading of Augustine and obvious reading of Leo the 13th, has been influenced by stuff from before. And when I look at scholars like Benedict or Hildebrand, I find that type of man where they have modern philosophical underpinnings, which are problematic, but they have traditional theological instincts because of stuff that they are personally into, also aesthetic instincts that are traditional and old school because of stuff they're into. And what you get is something much more desirable than what we've seen in the last decade or so. And there we go. All right. So pray for the restoration of the Latin Mass. Now, before I end here, it's not that I believe that the traditional Latin Mass cures everything. Of course I don't believe that. If that were the case, then how did we get, the revolution after the council or through the council, considering all those bishops were saying the traditional liturgy? But it's also the case that universal access to the traditional liturgy is immeasurably valuable. I am never going to bend the knee on my principles or compromise on the things that I know to be true about modernism and so forth. I'm never going to do that. But I try to have a spirit of understanding the way that, for example, the Society of St. Pius X has had. People mischaracterize them all the time. But if you look into, for example, the statements of the leadership of the society over the last 20, 30 years, they were very worried when Pope Benedict was elected, because remember, before he was the Pope, everyone saw him very much as like a centrist liberal. That's what he was seen as. And the society leadership was very cautious. And what they did is they prayed like crazy and launched a rosary crusade and wanted the Latin Mass to be available to all. And when it was, they were very happy about it. Does this mean that the traditionalist mentality had gone soft and that, everything's fine, we just get our fancy liturgy and we'll be fine? No, there are huge problems still. But the fact remains that there's like 1.5 billion Catholics, maybe a third of them go to Mass every Sunday worldwide. I don't know, maybe less. Hundreds of millions of people are going to Mass every Sunday. And in most places, if they're Latin Rite Catholics, the liturgy stinks. Most Catholics have their touch point, their interaction with the faith at the traditional Mass. At the Mass. That's where they interact. Even me, like I'm a guy who's, trying to be as well read as possible and in the faith. And even in my case, I don't have access to daily Mass. We just don't have access here. I go to Mass on Sundays and holy days. So every time I interact with the church in a physical way where I'm present, it's with the Mass. And it's Sunday Mass. That's what most Catholics' lives are like. So in that sense, you have to understand that the traditional Latin Mass, it's like a catechism in itself. Imagine a scenario like this. If you had two groups of people, 100 people in this group, 100 people in that group, and both of them were, account for whatever you have to account for studies. They're all the same kind of person. They have the same habits, whatever. And you said, this group of 100 people has to go to the Novus Ordo for 1 year, every Sunday and Holy Day. This group has to go to the traditional Latin Mass every Sunday and every Holy Day. And both groups are not allowed to do anything else. So there's no like catechism reading or just, regular lives, and you just go to this Mass once a week. I don't know what the exact results would be, but I can bet all my money, if I had any, that the group that went to the traditional Mass every Sunday and Holy Day would come out far more interested in the fullness of the faith and probably just more knowledgeable of the faith in general. There's no way to deny this. And it's not just the preaching, it's the element of the presentation of the true sacrifice and the reverence to the Holy Eucharist, the whole setting. It's everything. It's everything. So we have to all be rejoicing at the possibility and praying for the freedom of the traditional Mass, even if you believe it doesn't fix things in the full sense. Like there's obviously going to be other things, but it's invaluable that this liturgy be freed so that the average Catholic can experience, in the true sense, can have a interaction with the fullness of the faith represented in the apostolic liturgy. And that's something we need to pray for. Again, it doesn't fix everything, but it brings about the possibility of fixing a lot of things. I hope that makes sense. All right. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. God bless you all, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.